Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are cracking open the legal blueprint for public protest.
Yeah, this is fundamental stuff.
It really is. This isn't just about the right to assemble, your basic constitutional right.
Right.
This is the nitty-gritty, the framework for how you exercise that right while, the state keeps things orderly.
Exactly.
We're dissecting the core document here, the Regulation of Gatherings Act.
And this act, it's the absolute cornerstone for any discussion on public expression in this context.
Yes.
It was put in place, really, to manage that critical balance.
Which is?
Allowing citizens their say, letting them express views freely, but also making sure public spaces stay safe, stay functional. Its purpose is crystal clear. Regulate public gatherings, regulate demonstrations, and establish order. And accountability, too, in what can be, let's face it, volatile situations sometimes.
What's really interesting, I think, is where it starts, right in the preamble. It's this immediate, explicit nod to a core democratic idea that everyone has the right to assemble, to express views publicly, and get state protection while doing it. That's a powerful promise up front.
It is powerful, yeah. But, the very next breath essentially sets the legal standard for that promise.
Ah, the condition.
The condition. The act immediately says, okay, you have this right, but it must be exercised peacefully and critically with due regard to the rights of others.
And that phrase, due regard to the rights of others, that's basically the linchpin for everything else, isn't it?
Absolutely. That's the lever the state uses for pretty much every rule we're about to talk through. It shapes the whole framework.
Okay, let's unpack those rules then, starting with the basics definitions, because legally speaking, the difference between a few people and a crowd is huge. For you listening, the head count is key.
Right.
We've got a demonstration, which is small scale, just 1 to 15 people. Think like a focused picket line.
And then the moment you hit 16 people or more, boom, you're suddenly in the territory of a legal gathering.
16, that's the magic number.
That's the threshold. And a gathering is defined as any assembly, concourse, or procession of more than 15 persons in a public place. And, the law isn't subtle about why this matters.
It's political.
It's explicitly political. The definition kicks in when you're discussing, criticizing, or promoting government policy, actions, failures, or even just forming pressure groups.
So the law is basically saying, look, 16 people talking policy in public isn't just a chat, it's a regulated event.
Precisely. It triggers this whole set of regulations.
And if you cross that line into gathering territory, the Act immediately assigns specific roles and responsibilities. Chapter 1 lays out these key players.
Yes. These 3 roles form the kind of mandatory consultation group. First up, the convener.
The organizer.
The main organizer, yes. Right. The single point person responsible for all the arrangements, making sure notice is given, and crucially, they have to be there at the gathering. If it's an organization holding it, they have to appoint this person. They carry the legal weight.
Okay, 1 convener. Then you have the state players.
Right. The local authority appoints a responsible officer. Think of them as the council's point person, managing the act's functions in that specific area.
The local gatekeeper.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's the authorized member. This is the police representative.
Not just any officer, though.
No. Designated by the commissioner, usually someone experienced, whose job is specifically to represent the police in all the consultations and negotiations about the gathering.
So, convener, responsible officer, authorized member, these 3 have to talk.
They have to. Which brings us neatly to the mandatory process. This is where that right to assemble really meets the bureaucratic reality.
The paperwork.
The paperwork and the planning. It starts with the 7-day rule.
Tell us about that.
The law demands you plan ahead. The convener must give written notice to the responsible officer at least 7 days before the gathering.
7 full days.
Minimum. This lead time is seen as crucial for public order. It gives the responsible officer and the police time to figure out traffic, resources, potential risks, all of that.
Okay, but hang on. What about, urgent events? A sudden political crisis, a big announcement. People might want to react now. 7 days feels like forever in politics.
Right, and the Act does acknowledge that. There's an exception. If it's genuinely not reasonably possible to give 7 days notice.
Like a truly unforeseen event.
Exactly. Then the convener has to give notice at the earliest opportunity. But, and this is a huge but.
There's always a catch.
There's a catch. If that notice comes in less than 48 hours before the planned start time.
Less than 2 days.
Less than 2 days.
Sure.
The responsible officer gets the power to just prohibit the gathering, flat out.
Wow. So that 48-hour cutoff basically makes spontaneous protests legally very risky.
Extremely risky. You risk immediate prohibition. Spontaneity is really squeezed out by that rule.
And assuming you do give notice on time, what needs to be in that notice? Is it just, we're gathering here?
Oh, no. It's far more detailed. It's basically a logistics plan you're submitting.
Like,
You need the purpose, the exact time, duration, place. You need an estimate of participant numbers. Crucially, you need details on your marshals.
marshals, like internal security.
Pretty much. You need to say how many marshals you'll have and how they'll be identifiable, armbands, vests, whatever. They're the conveners team on the ground. And if it's a march, a procession.
The route?
The exact and complete route, start point, end point, the whole path. The state expects organizers, often just volunteers, remember, to act almost like professional event planners.
Okay, so the detailed notice goes in. Then what?
Consultation. It's mandatory. The responsible officer must consult with the authorized member, the police rep.
And they discuss the plan.
Yes. If they think changes are needed, maybe for safety or traffic flow, they'll call a meeting with a convener.
A negotiation, essentially.
Ideally, yes. They aim for agreement. But if they can't agree, the responsible officer can unilaterally impose conditions.
Just impose them. On what grounds?
On reasonable grounds is the term used. But it's focused strictly on managing the physical event, not the message.
Right, logistics, not ideology.
Exactly. So conditions might be about keeping traffic disruption minimal, especially during rush hour, maybe keeping a certain distance from a rival protest group, ensuring access to buildings isn't blocked, and the big one, preventing injury or property damage.
So the state manages how you protest, not what you protest about. But what about stopping it altogether? Prohibition, what's the legal bar for that? Seems like it should be high.
It is high. Intentionally so. They can't just ban your gathering because they think it might get rowdy or they don't like the cause.
So what do they need?
The responsible officer needs credible information on oath. So, sworn testimony, basically.
Okay, evidence.
Evidence suggesting a real threat of serious traffic disruption, serious injury, or extensive property damage. That's the first part.
And the second part, you said it was critical.
Yes. They also have to be convinced, based on that evidence, that the police and traffic officers will not be able to contain this threat, even with conditions imposed.
So it's not just there's a risk, there's a serious risk and we can't handle it.
Exactly. The burden is on the authorities to prove both things, credible threat and inability to contain it. It's a significant threshold.
That does sound tough to meet. Now, if the responsible officer does impose a condition you don't like or prohibits the gathering, what can the convener do? Is there an immediate appeal?
Yes, there's rapid recourse, but the clock is ticking fast.
How fast?
The convener can apply to a magistrate for a review, ask the magistrate to set aside the prohibition or change the condition. But that application has to be lodged within 24 hours.
Just one day.
One day. From when the condition or prohibition was issued, miss that window, you lose that immediate review option. There's also a possibility of an urgent appeal straight to the Supreme Court against the magistrate's decision. But that initial 24-hour deadline for the magistrate review is crucial.
Okay, 24 hours. That's tight. Now, even if they can't prohibit you based on a specific threat, are there places where protests are just off limits, permanent no-go zones?
Yes, Section 7 lays these out. These are geographic restrictions.
Where can't you gather?
You're generally prohibited from demonstrating or gathering within 100 meters of any court building, unless it's a weekend or public holiday.
Okay, keep protests away from active courts. Makes sense.
And then there are specific defined areas around the big symbols of democracy. Schedule 1 defines the restricted zone around the Parliament buildings in Cape Town.
Right near Parliament itself.
And Schedule 2 does the same for the Union buildings in Pretoria. These core areas are generally off-limits without specific prior written permission.
Got it. So let's shift gears to the actual event. The gathering is happening. What about conduct during the event? This is where the convener and those marshals you mentioned become really important.
Absolutely. Their duties are spelled out in Section 8. Marshals need to be clearly identifiable, as we said, and their main job is to take all reasonable steps.
Reasonable steps. That phrase again.
It's everywhere in law. Here, it means doing everything practical to ensure the gathering is peaceful, follows the agreed conditions, and crucially keeps access clear.
Access to buildings?
Yes. Ensuring entrances aren't blocked, with the specific mention of emergency services, hospitals, fire stations, ambulance depots. They have to be actively trying to prevent disorder and obstruction.
Okay, that's the marshals. What about the participants themselves? What are they specifically forbidden from doing? The list seems aimed at preventing violence and anonymity.
It is very specific, yes. No firearms, obviously. No imitation firearms either. And no dangerous weapons that's defined by a separate law, the Dangerous Weapons Act.
Right. What else?
No inciting hatred based on race, culture, sex, language, religion. No saying or doing things likely to provoke violence. And here's the one you picked up on. No wearing a disguise or mask that hides your face and stops you from being identified.
That's a big one. The law prioritizing identification over anonymity makes every participant accountable.
It forces accountability, yes. Also banned. Wearing uniforms that look like police or army uniforms. And you can't try to force or coerce anyone else into attending or joining the protest.
Okay. Now, the difficult part. What if things do go wrong? If order breaks down, how does the act regulate police intervention? It seems very structured.
It is. Section 9 lays out a tiered approach to using force. The first step is always non-lethal warning.
What does that involve?
Police must call on people to disperse. They have to give that order in at least 2 official languages, and ideally one the majority understands. And they have to give a reasonable time for people to actually leave.
A clear warning, time to comply, and if that fails, if people don't disperse.
Only then can the police order the use of force. But initially, it excludes weapons likely to cause serious injury or death. Think water cannons, maybe tear gas, depending on the situation.
And the level of force?
It must be only what's necessary and proportionate to get the crowd to disperse and restore order. Minimum force required.
That proportionality principle again. Even when using less lethal options. What about deadly force? When can firearms be used?
Only in the absolute most extreme circumstances. The order can only be given if a participant kills someone, seriously injures someone, or is attempting to cause serious damage to valuable property.
Yeah,
and
another condition.
Yes, and only if other methods to stop that specific threat have been tried and failed, or are clearly inappropriate for the situation. Even then, the force must still be moderated and strictly proportionate to stopping that immediate, specific, severe threat.
A very high bar, and rightly so. Okay, let's move to something that probably keeps conveners awake at night. Liability, financial responsibility if things go bad. The Act talks about riot damage. What does that cover?
It's defined broadly. Any loss suffered because of injury, death, or property destruction that happens directly or indirectly, immediately before, during, or even just after a gathering. If it's linked to the gathering, it could be riot damage.
And who pays the bill for that damage?
This is Section 11, and it's where the risk really hits home for organizers. The law imposes joint and several liability. For a gathering, remember, 16+ people, the organization that held it, or the convener personally, if there's no formal organization, is liable for that riot damage. Joint and several means the person who suffered the loss, say, a shop owner whose window was broken, can sue the convener for the entire cost, even if dozens of people were involved in the damage.
Wow. So the convener essentially carries the financial risk for the actions of potentially hundreds or thousands of people. That seems immense.
It is immense. And for a demonstration, 115 people, every single participant is jointly and severally liable.
So how on earth can an organization or a convener defend themselves if damage occurs? Is there any way out of that liability?
There is a defense, but honestly, it's incredibly difficult to meet. It's very stringent.
What do they have to prove?
3 things. First, they didn't permit or connive at the act causing the damage. Basically, they weren't complicit. Second, the damaging act wasn't part of the gathering's planned purpose and, crucially, was not reasonably foreseeable.
Not foreseeable. That sounds tough to prove in a volatile situation.
It can be. And the third part is the kicker. They must prove they took all reasonable steps to prevent the act from happening.
And just telling people be peaceful isn't enough, right? The act anticipates that.
It explicitly states that. Proof that the convener organization simply forbade the act is not sufficient for a defense. You have to show active, robust prevention measures were in place. Marshals properly briefed, liaising with police, managing the crowd effectively. The law basically demands proof you acted like a professional security operation.
Okay. Finally, let's quickly cover the penalties. What happens if you break these rules? Convening without notice, breaching a condition.
For those kinds of general offenses, failing to give notice, ignoring a condition, not showing up for a mandatory meeting, the penalty is generally a fine or imprisonment for up to 1 year.
Right. But is there anything treated more severely?
Yes. The Act singles out carrying a prohibited weapon during a gathering, that Section 8 offense we talked about. That specific act carries a much harsher potential penalty, a fine or imprisonment for up to 3 years.
3 years for carrying a weapon versus 1 year for procedural failures shows where the law places the emphasis on potential harm.
Definitely.
So wrapping this up, This act fundamentally takes the abstract right to protest and translates it into a very concrete, often demanding set of legal duties.
That's a good way to put it. It secures the democratic right, yes, but through this rigid, detailed framework that requires serious planning, that 7-day notice, the marshals.
And imposes really significant, almost strict liability if things go wrong.
It really underscores that the law values planned, orderly expression over spontaneous reaction. The moment you gather with 15 other people, you or your organization are taking on a massive potential liability.
Yeah.
Unless you can demonstrate you did everything reasonably possible to stop damage.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over as we finish this deep dive. If the Act puts such a premium on advance notice, with that tough 48-hour cutoff allowing easy prohibition, does this mechanism, designed primarily to manage potential violence and disruption, does it inadvertently make it much harder for timely, legitimate, but maybe unpopular political responses to actually happen? Does it dampen necessary dissent?
Something to consider. The balance between rights and order is always complex.